Hey guys, it's Paradise, and today we have something intriguing for all of you RPG and ARPG fans out there, and I'm going to do this spoiler-free. We managed to get around 6 hours of hands-on time with the new Dragon Age The Veilguard, which was spread across a variety of missions from the start of the game at level 1, all the way to some intense later sections of the game at level 30, thanks to EA for inviting us over to their HQ to play. Now, I have enjoyed the Dragon Age games, having played all of the previous titles, and I have to say Origins is by far my favourite for a variety of reasons, from the party control, to the interesting companions, and of course the gameplay that's kind of heavily inspired by Dungeons & Dragons. Well, a lot of these things have been heavily tweaked or completely changed in Veilguard, both for better and worse. So let's go over my impressions and review of the 6 hours I got to play at this preview event. Do drop a like below if you enjoy our updates and guides on all your favourite games, and we need to start it off by talking about the combat and minute-to-minute gameplay, as this is the biggest fundamental change to the Dragon Age formula. Dragon Age The Veilguard, as many of you may already know from the trailers and gameplay out there, is no longer a tactical, almost isometric style of RPG, but instead is now a fully fledged action RPG, and the feeling of the combat very much reflects this. You're going to be spending your time in combat focusing on doing combos, blocking, parrying, and guarding, instead of micromanaging your party, focusing on abilities and positioning. So the emphasis of the actual gameplay is in the direct control of your character, who's the only character you can now directly control, and dealing with the group of enemies or the boss at hand. Your abilities and companion abilities are supplementary to this, and although they are still impactful, the actual gameplay is focused on you controlling your character, which is pretty standard for an actual action RPG. So with this, it of course means full party control is no longer present in the same way as it was in previous games in the series, but now you command them to specifically target and attack an enemy or activate one of their powers between a cooldown. But having now played the game and got plenty of time to get used to the combat, it's a much more simplified system than before, and I really wasn't liking the look of this new party control system, as it was one of the things I loved about the previous games. However, having now played it, I have to say, because of them fully committing to the action RPG approach, I actually think this works quite well. Adding any additional micromanaging on top of the fairly active combat system would actually, in my opinion, become much more of a chore, especially in the later game areas and higher level fights. This is because you need to be paying attention to what is going on in front of you by doing dodges and parries, which are quite important, and you want to time your attacks to get your combos off, chain your abilities together, and so on, so any more party control would actually be kind of like a hindrance, which honestly I was surprised to feel that way, coming from a background of liking the old system. So now I can see the vision behind this major change, and it's simply because it doesn't work as well as it did in previous games due to the shift to full-on action combat. Next, let's talk about the world and level design, as this is another step away from Inquisition, the last game in the series. At least from what I got to experience, the change creates more linear, kind of curated maps and levels. There were some zones that were a bit larger with additional pathways and things to explore, but the majority of what I got to experience was more akin to a series of linear levels with some offshoots to find various goodies and loot. But to progress, you must follow the main path, which did feel like many of the actual story missions were sort of on a set of tracks as you go from beat to beat. That being said, I would much rather have actual curated, handcrafted, more linear levels with some exploration offshoots than a massive open area with loads of downtime and little substance. So there is a balance to strike, and of course I didn't get to experience everything in the game, but I will say the maps kind of felt similar to the layout of Stellar Blades maps, excluding the slightly more open areas that are spread throughout. There is a fast travel system, side quests, puzzles, and hidden things to find, and it looked like you could fast travel back to previously visited areas, so it's not super restrictive once you get further in the game, but I did want to point out that the actual missions I got to do did feel fairly linear, which is a contrast to Inquisition's larger open maps. But again, it didn't bother me too much as the general overarching story and mission that I did get to play was actually pretty engaging. I think there's a good amount here for proper Dragon Age fans with experience of the novels, comics, and games, but also it's a good entry point into the series as no prior knowledge of the characters or world is needed, but there are plenty of details, lore tidbits, and interactions that old fans would definitely pick up on. Next, I want to touch on the difficulty, because this will always be a big point in a game that is focused on full action combat. At the start of the game, things felt extremely easy to the point of confusion given that you are not going to master a game's combat system within the first couple of hours. Even your abilities were like one-shotting enemies. That being said, when I then jumped to some later game missions that we had access to and changed my class so I could try, each class that was available, the difficulty was flipped on its head, partly because of not knowing how to play this new class yet, but also because there is clear progression in how enemies behave and how strong you as a character are against enemies, versus those first couple hours in the game where just your basic combos and one skill was enough to destroy everything. In addition to this, the boss fights felt particularly engaging, and while we couldn't record many of the harder bosses and events that we did get to play, I can say several of them were pretty cool and fairly intense, feeling even a little brutal at times. So you really need to pay attention to what's going on with their animations and attacks with that new combat system to parry and dodge as needed. It really does become vital. On top of all of this, difficulty concerns are remedied and alleviated with multiple difficulty options and a very in-depth custom option to tailor pretty much everything difficulty-wise to your preference. So on the difficulty front, it's clear that it starts very easy and ramps up later, but it's also all customizable anyway. Now let's quickly go over the classes and specializations, because I did get to try each of the classes and a few specializations, but we will have a follow-up video on these in more detail. Each of the classes, in my opinion, actually felt very different to how they did in previous Dragon Age games, and this is of course due to the higher level of control you have over your particular character, with each class feeling very distinct in their own playstyle, with the rogue being very dodge and parry focused with bow and arrow shots mixed between, the warrior being a more steadfast character able to block with a sword and shield or charge in with a two-handed weapon, while the mage was my biggest surprise for how different it felt. Traditionally in Dragon Age games, I like to play as a mage, but with the new action combat, although it definitely works and has its place and playstyle, I just found the rogue and warrior to be more engaging and interesting minute to minute, getting stuck in rather than constantly kiting and trying to control the field as a mage. That being said, the specializations definitely mix things up and kind of funnel you into specific build types for each specialization, and we'll have more specifics on that coming soon. I'll also caveat this and say the mage does have some cool specializations that focus more so on close to mid-range melee, with the Spellblade, which looks like a kind of revamped Knight Enchanter, and it has an Invoker specialization that looks particularly cool and flashy. And next I want to touch on the companions and story, because one of the things that makes Dragon Age so special is its deep lore and interesting characters. Without spoiling any details of the story, I can say that it still feels very Dragon Age-y. There's world-threatening enemies, dragons, demons, monsters, and darkspawn, so it's definitely in keeping to its dark fantasy roots with how everything goes down between your party and Solus, and the premise of the plot did have me hooked right away. The characters also feel very crafted with their own personalities and agendas, and they don't feel shallow, at least from what I experienced, and this does come with juggling the ever-present approval system, which is no doubt tied to various party benefits, and of course romancing, which sadly I didn't get to test out. We did also get to experience some companion side missions, and they felt like fully fledged stories that felt important, while more regular side missions also felt rewarding in their outcomes, with things like learning more about Solus's past before he became the Dreadwolf that we know, and how everything went down with the elves while they were at the height of their power before the creation of the Veil. Another thing I liked was the impactful choices that you could actually make, and many games love to sell you on this idea that your choices matter, but in Dragon Age Veilguard, There are at least some choices that have world-altering implications, and I won't say any more than that. Just be ready for some major story choices, because they do have an impact. Also, the character creation was highly in-depth, and you could really make a character however you want, and we'll have more on this coming soon too. I will quickly go over the graphics and performance as we always do, since it's an important element to any game. To me, the game looks pretty great. It is a more stylized, unique art style than previous Dragon Age games, so that may come with a bit of a disconnect to the roots of the series, but after a couple hours you kind of get over it and it felt nice. The levels were designed with plenty of details, statues, things around, elevation, and generally a nice backdrop to wherever you were, so it was pretty immersive and pleasing to get into. For the performance, I'm pleased to say that my experience had no issues with frame rates, crashes, and everything felt very polished and smooth. It could have been because the machines we were playing on were rocking 40 series Nvidia cards, and I don't know the rest of their specs unfortunately, but overall from my personal playing, I can't fault the performance. But I did notice the person next to me did crash at one point, although I didn't experience that myself, it's something to keep in mind. One of the major concerns I do have though is with the game's gear system. From your weapons to your armor and accessories, as an action RPG, you kind of want and need a good progression system with impactful and weighty upgrades. The way this gear progression system is handled in Veilguard comes down to a twofold upgrade system. You can upgrade your gear at the Caretaker, which is in your sort of hub-style base of operations, to +1, 2, 3, and so on, and this grants direct stat upgrades like more damage or defense. The second element to this is the rarity of your gear, which unlocks additional perks, and rarity is upgraded by finding sort of duplicate versions of the items that you have through quest rewards and possible loot, going from white to green, blue, purple, and orange. These perks also offer statistical upgrades with things like percentage of damage, durations to things, resistances, and so on, but very little of these things actually have impactful and cool things that actually happen in combat, like Destiny's exotic system, where they would actually do something different and unique. I can, however, say there are very rare red pieces of unique gear, which I wasn't allowed to capture as it was during a restricted mission, but they do have special unique effects, such as a trinket that I found that made my potion drop bees on the ground to attack nearby enemies. But these didn't seem like consistent things you would constantly find to mix up your actual gameplay. So progression seems like it's mostly about tweaking the numbers of things instead of actual new in-combat effects and abilities, which is important because remember you can only bring 3 abilities at a single time in combat, which does create a somewhat repetitive feeling. But all in all, I was pleasantly surprised by how they managed to pull off this big change to pure action combat, and how it did actually feel pretty good, with good class diversity and build diversity, albeit with some repetition. It did feel like a Dragon Age game to me, which was one of my biggest concerns, especially after so many changes throughout its development cycle. So Dragon Age The Veilguard, after playing it a good chunk, is actually something I'm pleasantly surprised about and excited to play more of. Of course, we'll have to see how things shape up, if there is a sort of endgame or how long the overall title is, but from my playing, I have to say I was actually surprised and I kind of went in skeptical given the long development of the game and its major changes compared to previous titles in the series. So what do you think about all of this? Tell me down below because I'd love your thoughts, and subscribe for more Dragon Age and videos on your favorite games coming very, very soon.